On today's episode of the pod, I am talking about how I learnt to love myself, the good and the bad, and how it changed how I live, love, and work. This is not going to be a mushy episode filled with sunflowers and rain dances and me telling you you should love yourself. I'm a firm believer that you do you, and I'll do me. However, you may decide after listening that this is something you want to try. Today I give my open, honest look at the highs and lows of this journey for myself and why I truly believe that there is no other way to live mindfully and wholeheartedly. Hello and welcome to episode 19. Episode 19, people, of the Live Mindfully podcast. It is at this point that I am reminded of a conversation I had with some friends way back in December when we threw a barbecue at our house and someone said, "Did everyone have a good week? Anyone do anything interesting?" To which I replied, "Well, I started a podcast." And my technologically challenged friend said, "Oh, what's that? Is that where you talk and people listen or something?" Indeed it is. And then he said, "Aren't you going to run out of topics?" And to which his very, very clever wife responded, "Have you met Laurie?" The truth is I could talk underwater, but you already knew that. So here we are at 19 weeks in, and I still have a plethora of subjects I want to cover. And for those who want to know how I come up with a topic each week, I really feel into the topics that have generally arisen within my conversations with my friends and my family, or what I have noticed come up within myself. I do believe that we are all connected, so I have a lot of faith and trust each week that the topics I cover will resonate. So I don't plan these podcasts out even a week in advance most of the time, and most of the topics come to me organically. So this past week I have been away camping, and I am so thrilled and excited because this is the very last time that I will camp. And I have told my husband, ever. Next time I go camping, I will be in my brand new spanking Jayco. That's right, my friends. No more bad back and no more bad attitude for me. But I noticed something this time we went away. I noticed that I handled myself a little differently, that I communicated to myself, to my husband, and to my friends a little differently. What I most noticed within myself was that I didn't have underlying anxiety about the week. I was very confident in my decision making and very comfortable in saying no when it felt like a no. And what I love most about all of this is that I know why I felt so good. I have finally started loving myself more than judging, questioning, and belittling myself. And I don't even think I really knew that I did those things up until around about 18 months ago. So about 18 months ago, I listened to a podcast with Mel Robbins. And if you check the show notes, there will be a link in there with the podcast that I listened to. And at that time, she had a book that had just come out titled 8 Rules of Love, which is what she was promoting on the podcast, obviously. But she also has another book titled The High Five Habit. Now, FYI, I haven't read either of the books, but in the podcast I listened to, she talked about the concept of high-fiving yourself in the morning in the mirror. She said that over time, our mirrors, the ones we see ourselves through, get covered with dust. And we start to see a very muddled version of ourselves. It's not the version our friends see. It might be the version our families see. What I have noticed in my years on this earth is that our family members' vision of us can be muddled, and our vision of them can also be muddled because of our preconceived ideas. And They have preconceived ideas about us and we have preconceived ideas about them and who they are. And these ideas that we can have and that our family members can have, let me tell you, they can be extremely hard to change, especially if you have family members who are stuck in their way of thinking. Even family members who believe they are doing the work, they can still be stuck in their way of thinking just as we can. It's very tricky business. So sometimes I will tell people who work with me that we need to have at least one friend or one confidant who we believe truly sees us. It's so important that we have at least one person in our lives who can actually see who we are beneath it all. So going back to Mel Robbins and the high five habit, when I first listened to her talk about this high five habit, she talked about waking up and walking straight to the mirror and giving yourself a high five. And look, to be honest, my initial reaction to this was, this is stupid. Who's going to do that? But then when she mentioned the dusty mirror, I thought, well, that has some merit, because I know I am my own worst critic. And I know that you are your own worst critic. I know that for a fact. And some of you listening right now, I've never even met you. So how do I know for a fact that you are your own worst critic? Because we all are. And for some reason, we seem to wear that as a bit of a badge. I hear myself say it and others as well. Oh, I'm my own worst critic. Like somehow being a DICK to myself is okay because it's so widely accepted. And when you say that in a group setting, oh, I'm my own worst critic, everyone nods. And someone will say, oh, of course you are. We all are. But why are we? And why should we be? Like, why should we be the person in our own lives always putting ourselves down? Doesn't it make more sense to be your own biggest cheerleader? Because when SHIT hits the fan, the only person you can 100% count on is yourself. If you dug the hole or fell into it, you, my friend, you are going to have to work really hard to get yourself out of it. And sure, people might help. They might throw you a ladder or some might even crawl down the hole a little so you don't feel so alone. But unless you do the work to get yourself out, you're stuck there. So doesn't it make more sense for each of us to be on our own side? And I'm positive that if we hunt long enough, we're going to find someone else willing to criticize us. Unfortunately for some of us, we don't actually have to look too hard for that other person. And how do we feel when someone criticizes us? I hate it. I hate when someone criticizes me, and yet I do it to myself all the time. And so I was thinking about all of this as Mel explained the dust on the mirror analogy, and I thought, yeah, that resonates. I can see that. And then she explains that high-fiving yourself starts to remove a little bit of the built-up dust and eventually all of the dust. And now I'm not saying we all need to run to our mirrors and start high-fiving ourselves. If you want to do that, have at it. If you don't, that's cool too. But here's what I want to ask you. Can you even look at yourself in the mirror? Can you make eye contact with yourself and just look into your own eyes? My guess is no. And I get it. I was surprised at how hard this was too. And shortly after Mel's podcast, I listened to Pastor Joel Osteen do a podcast with Oprah. And again, the link will be in the show notes. And this one is 100%, we should all listen to this one. It's only 24 minutes long. And he talks about a member of his church who wakes up in the morning and she starts each day by walking to the mirror and saying, "Girl, you're looking good today." And some days she says, "Girl, some days you look good, but today you look really good." And I loved that. And so this whole concept was playing on my mind, and I found the mirror thing really hard. So instead, I just started to bring much more awareness into how often I judged myself or criticized myself. I began to notice how I blame and shame myself. And then I became acutely aware of what happens, the behavior that transpires when I do this. I noticed how I felt, how I began to treat others around me when I was in these particular states. I became so much more conscious of how I swallow things that are painful, and then how I self-medicate or numb using alcohol. I noticed that on certain days, sitting with myself was really hard in meditation, and it was particularly difficult when I had been my harshest critic, had not spoken a truth, and then had self-medicated. What alarmed me was that most days I criticized or chastised myself in one way or another. I noticed that I wasn't particularly kind to myself, and just having this awareness was enough for me to begin wanting to swim in the other direction. I remember thinking, I would never speak like this to my brother or my sister. I would never say these things to my friend. And I would 100% never think this way about my children or my husband. I remember listening to Maya Angelou's book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and in it she talks about an incident where she says to someone who has spoken rudely to her, "You don't get to talk to me like that. Don't you know who I am? I am a child of God." And that resonated so deeply with me when I thought of all of the awful ways I've spoken to myself and all of the awful ways I've treated myself. And it's not okay. In that moment, I decided it's not okay for me to treat myself this way. And I made a promise to myself that I will never do that again. And it was that day that I forced myself to the mirror. And I remember spending 1 minute every day for like a full month, just staring into my own eyes. And in the beginning, I set a timer because I knew I couldn't last a whole minute. And in the very, very beginning, I would be fighting back tears because I didn't understand why it was so hard to just look at myself. And I realized there was so much work that I needed to do there. There was so much dust built up. But every day when I got to that mirror, I started to remove some of the dust, just like Mel said. I noticed that it got easier and easier. And I would remind myself that I believe most of us are good people with big, good hearts who genuinely want the best for ourselves and for others. And I reminded myself that I am also a good person with a good heart who genuinely wants the best for everybody. I reminded myself of the quote by Henry Ford, "Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right." I began to really see myself. I began to really trust myself, trust my intuition, and care so much less about what other people thought. One day I found myself placing my hand against the mirror, my hand against my hand. And I remember looking in the mirror and saying, "It's you and me, babe. You and me against the world. And we've got this." And I didn't feel funny or weird. I didn't feel like I was forcing myself. I felt empowered. I felt like I could take on anything and be great at it because I had my back. Finally. I finally had my back, and I was not going to let anyone mess with me. And it hasn't been easy, But I've noticed now that I don't self-medicate or use alcohol to numb or manage hard emotions. I don't spiral, or as Brené Brown calls it, chandelier, when I do something that isn't my best moment or I don't communicate well enough, because now I do. I don't project. I am so forgiving of myself. I am so much clearer in my communication. I have no fear around setting and maintaining my own boundaries and respecting other people's. I know what is for me and I know what isn't. When something happens, I think, how would I handle this? If this happened to one of my children, and then I tell myself, it's okay, you made a mistake, what can we do to rectify it? I'm proactive in my behavior. I do not take BS from anyone. I am kind, but I'm not a people pleaser. I don't have time to put myself down because I am too busy creating the future I want to live in and the future I want my children to grow up in. I place my needs first, and I feel completely guilt-free about this. And more than anything, for the first time in a really long time, I feel genuinely accepting and joyous about who I am and the life I am living. And I don't give two flying forks what anybody else thinks. I am no longer the first person shooting myself down. I don't point out my own faults. I don't ridicule my looks or my behavior or my belly fat. I am so much more open because I am not the one taking hits at myself. I have this fire inside. I'm genuinely grateful. Pastor Joel Osteen says you can talk yourself into your dreams and you can talk yourself out of your dreams. And I believe the same is true of self-love. You can talk yourself into loving yourself or out of loving yourself. But as someone who has walked over to the other side, I can tell you which one has a humongous positive knock-on effect. It's not easy, but you need to find what works for you. I know of people who have taped a picture of themselves as a child on their mirrors and used that to build a self-love practice. For me, becoming aware and then looking in the mirror and then eventually holding my hand against my own hand and then talking words of inspiration and love worked. There is absolutely no way I would have been able to do that straight off the bat. And I would like to add that I also don't think that there is a right or a wrong way to do this, but we need to do it. It's an important process, an important step if we want to lead better lives. For me, I had to work in very slow stages. My first step was simply becoming aware of the kind of language and thoughts I was having about myself and noticing how critical I was. And for me, this was an unconscious behavior. I was not consciously aware of how critical I was of myself. And once I became aware, I began to observe how that behavior manifested, how it made me feel, and what my reactions were, how I treated other people around me, particularly my children and my husband, how I projected, how I turned little problems into mountains, how I called people and whinged about my life, how I had this simmering anger just beneath the surface, waiting to explode all over someone who did just enough to tick me off. And when it was really bad, how I would numb. And from there, I began to catch myself and shift that behavior. I started to dig deeper, question my behavior, ask myself why I would ever think it was okay to speak to myself in that way or to treat myself in that way. And only then was I able to start to look at myself in the mirror and start to reverse this lack of love that I knew was present. At some point in my life, I cultivated this practice of being unkind to myself, and I needed to undo that. For me, that was fundamental. I refused to live my life having me as my biggest critic. I refuse it. I reject it. I will not be the person who inhibits my own success, my own love, and my own joy. And I really hope that you don't want that for yourself either. I really hope that you want to be empowered, that you want to have your own back, that you want to trust yourself so fiercely that you don't give two flying forks what anyone thinks about the way you're living your best life. Because, babe, you've got this. It's you and you against the world. And if you don't start having your own back, then who's going to? Thank you so much for listening to today's podcast. I hope you're feeling inspired and hopeful, and that you start to think of different ways to improve the way you treat yourself. Until next week, take good care of yourself.